All right, so we'll say good morning. Try to get a little bit of an on-time start for the daf today. A lot to do. Baruch Hashem. I'm going to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tammuz, Adam and Yudit Benzev, for dedicating all the Shumer Drashos this month in honor of their children, Jake, Sarina, and Rosie, and to thank Chaim Lifshitz from Yerushalayim for dedicating the daf today in memory of his father, Jack Lifshitz, Chaim Yaakov ben Reb Tzvi. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an aliyah and the family a nechama. We'll see with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Ayin Beis 72, a lot to do today. We left off on Ayin Aleph Amud Beis 71b, and we left off, where did we leave off? Ravina Amar, right? We got Ravina Amar. So we'll say, so about 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 22, 24. About 25 lines up from the bottom. Ravina Amar. So we'll say, so remember again, it's a lot of lines. Okay, probably should have counted from the top. All right, right. So Ravina says this. So we'll say, so remember again, just to orient. But I want to point out, we're going to get a little technical for Amar Aleph, but then we're going to have some incredibly magnificent agarata on Amud Beis. So we'll say, so remember again, the Mishnah discussed the big day kahuna, and now the Gemara is discussing over here how different parts of the big day kahuna, as well as we'll see different utensils in the Beis Hamikdash, had a different levels of thread counts. So I will say, so Ravina says from here, so we'll say, so remember again, we were discussing the idea that sheish is linen. So where do we know this from? So Ravina says from here, so both say here, then Pasik in Yecheskel kind of says it straight out. They'll have hats made of linen on their heads and pants made of linen on their bodies, or amasneim literally means on their loins. So both say, so you see from here quite explicitly that Allah Lamaisa, the big day kuna are made of linen. To which the Gemara says, Amli Ravashi, Hami Kameda Asi Yecheskel Man Amra. That's very nice. That's a pasuk in Yecheskel. Here's the problem. There were Kohanim before Yecheskel, right? It was basically this before Yecheskel. So before Yecheskel said this in a pasuk, how did we know that the bid kahuna were made of linen? From where did we know this? To which the Gemara says, Tamech, Hadam Rav Chisda, Davar Zemitars Moshe Rabbeinu Lo Lamadnu, B'Divrei Yecheskel B'Uzi Lamadnu. Further, we have an interesting statement that says, we did not learn this concept from the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu. Instead, we learned this from the words of Yecheskel. What did we learn? What did we learn? Kol ben nechar arale va'arabas lo yava ad mikdashi l'shar sini. What the pasuk says that an uncircumcised Kohen is not permitted to go ahead and do the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash. So Yecheskel says it explicitly. Yet we know that this halacha applied before Yecheskel as well. So Hamikamei the Asi Yecheskel Man Amra, who said this before Yecheskel said it? So I will say, so it's interesting because you have these psukim in Sefer Yecheskel, but these were halachas that applied from the beginning of the Mikdash. So before Yecheskel said it, how did we know it? Ela Gemara Gemirila va'asi Yecheskel va'asmuchu akra. Rather, I will say some of these things were part of the oral tradition, Torah Shabbat Peh, and Yecheskel was the first one who explicitly said it. So the Gemara says, Hachanami, so to over here, we knew that the big day kahuna were made of linen, but again, the Gemara says, Hachanami, Gemara Gemirila, Va'ase Yecheskel Va'asmucha Akra. It was a tradition. It was a tradition from beforehand, and Yecheskel came along and ultimately went ahead and put it into a pasuk. So both say, so essentially what the Gemara is saying is like this. Certain concepts, like the big day kahuna being linen, or bad being linen, or for that matter, again, uncircumcised kohanim being unable to do the avodah in the mikdash, these are things that were handed down to Moshe Rabbeinu already at Matan Torah. They weren't written. Yecheskel came along and ultimately writes them down, but they were already part of Torah Shabbat Peh from the beginning. Mashizar, so whenever the Torah says Mashizar always means shmona, always refers to a thread that is made from 8 individual strands. So minalan, from where do we know this? Dichsev vayasve al shulei hamiil rimoni tcheles va'argaman v'tolash shani mashizar. So both say the Torah when it speaks about the rimonim are the pomegranates, right, which were on the bottom of the clothing of the Kohen Gadol. of the Kohen, excuse me. So therefore, the Torah, when it discusses ultimately again the Rimonim, calls them Shuli HaMe'il, puts them on the hem of the Me'il. Rimoni Tcheles va'agaman v'tola shani mashizar v'yolif mashizar miparochas. We make a gzir shav of mashizar from the parochas, right, from the curtain of the mikdash, of the mishkan, to the Rimonim. Ma lahalon esrim va'arba afkan esrim va'arba. Just like the curtain had a thread count of 24, so too the Rimonim have a thread count of 24. Dohavi kol chad v'chad tamni. Each strand, or each thread was made up of 8 strands. I v'neilif michoshen ve'ephod. Why don't you learn out the Rimonim from the choshen and the ephod? Right, the choshen ultimately is the breastplate. The ephod is the apron. Ma lahalon esrim ushmona. Afkan esrim ushmona. Just like over there was a thread count of 28, so too over here there's a thread count of 28. Done in davar shalom nav. That's a suggestion. I shouldn't say that as a statement. That's a suggestion. Learn out the Rimonim from the choshen and the ephod. To which the Gemara says, done in davar shalom ne'amar bo zahav, mi davar shalom ne'amar bo zahav. We want to learn out something which the word zahav, gold, is not written. It's not written Rimonim ultimately it's not written zahav by the Rimonim, and it's not written zahav by the parochas. Lafuke choshen ve'ephod shenemra bahen zahav, as opposed to the choshen and the ephod where zahav is written. Adrabah, I can say just the opposite. Donin beged mi beged. We should learn out Rimonim, which is part of a beged, from choshen and ephod, which are part of the beged. Lafuke parochas de ohelhu, as opposed to learning out the Rimonim from the parochas. The parochas is not a beged; it's part of the structure. Elo donin me'avneit. Rather, we're going to learn out ultimately again from the avneit. The donin beged v'davar shalom ne'amar bo zahav, and we'll learn out the Rimonim from the avneit because both of them are beged, and gold is not written by them. Mi beged v'davar shalom ne'amar bo zahav, ve'in donin davar she'in bo zahav. We won't learn out Rimonim from choshen and ephod because Rimonim don't have gold. Choshen and ephod do have gold. Rav Mari Amar Ta'asenu Ksiv. Rav Mari says, the pasuk says Ta'asenu. Rashi says by the choshen it says so shall you make it. So the Gemara darshans like this: Ta'asenu lezev lo la'acher, that the choshen is made uniquely. Nothing else resembles the choshen, and therefore you can't learn out the thread count for the Rimonim from the choshen. Rav Ashi Amar va'asisa ksiv shiu kol asiyos shavos. Furthermore, again, the pasuk says va'asisa by the Rimonim, telling me that again, ultimately, all the way you make the Rimonim must be the same. Behechi navid. So we'll say, how should you do this? So hechi navid tlasa da'asara asara. Navid tlasa da'asara asara. If you go ahead and you make 3 of the threads made, and you make them of a 10 strand count, havilu tlasin. Ultimately, it comes out to 30. Navid trade the tisha v'chad dasara. If you make 2 of them of 9 strands, 1 of them of 10 strands, amarkra va'asisa. Torah says va'asisa shukol siyosav shavos. Therefore, I both say the Gemara therefore highlights the idea that the Rimonim themselves are learned out either from one of 2 possibilities, either from the parochas, or if you want to learn out from another beged, the thread count is learned from the avneit, from the belt. Good. Mi'il shnei masar. So we'll say the mi'il is made ultimately again, where every thread is made up of 12 strands, or 12, we'll call 12 strands or 12 cords. So minalan, from where do we know this? Tichsev vasisa es mi'il ha'ephod, top of ayin beis, kalil tcheles. So the pasuk says that the me'il is made of kalil tcheles, literally means braided tcheles. So the Gemara says v'yalav tcheles mi parochas, and we make a gzir shav of tcheles from the parochas. Ma lahalon shisha afkan shisha, just like over here or just like over there by the parochas. Ultimately, again, it's 6 strands for each thread. Afkan shisha, so too over here halacha lamaisa. It'll be 6 strands for each thread. V'neilav mishulya v'rimonim. Why not go ahead and learn it out from the hem and from the rimonim? Malahalan shmona afkan shmona. And say just like over there, it was 8 strands for each thread. So too over here. Donin kli mi kli ve'in donin kli mi tachshit kli. We will say we'd rather go ahead and learn out one kli from another kli, and not ultimately, again, learn out the kli from what we call a tachshit kli, a more ornamental or accessorized kli. Okay, adrabba, I can see just the opposite. Donin gufo mi gufo, ve'in donin gufo me alma. Why not learn out the me'il itself, ultimately again from another part of the me'il, and not go ahead and learn it from something separate and distinct? Hainu da'amin l'shar begadim shelo ne'emar bahen sheish. So ultimately, you're going to say that's what we meant before when we said that you can learn out from other begadim, which the Torah does not go ahead and use the word sheish, like for example the me'il. Good. Paroches esim va'arba. The paroches ultimately again each strand, each thread is made up of 24 strands. Dalid deshisa shisa. So we'll say ultimately again we have four strands, right? Literally four threads that are each made up of 6 different items, because you also remember again, for certain items, as we're going to see over here, like by the paroches, you had a thread, which was one thread was comprised of multiple things. For example, you could have wool and blue, you could have blue wool and red wool and gold, all of that mixed together to form one thread. So the Gemara says, paroches esim va'arba. So the paroches, again, each thread was made up of 24 strands. So dalid deshisa shisa, ultimately, again, 4 of them made up of 6 types of material each. So the Gemara says, lo dina velo daina. And this doesn't really require any more explanation because it's actually pretty explicit in the Torah itself. Choshen ve'ephod esim u'shmona. Choshen and ve'ephod are made up of threads that have a 28 string count, or 28 strand count. Minalan, where do we know that from? V'chsiv v'asisa choshen mishpat ma'aseh choshev ki ma'aseh ephod ta'asenu. That ultimately, again, the Gemara says, you shall go ahead and make the choshen and the ephod. Or actually, you should make the choshen like the ephod. Zahav tcheles v'argaman v'tola'as shani v'sheish mashezar. So we'll say the Torah explicitly says all of the various items that go into each thread. Arba'ad the shisa. So we'll say, so you have ultimately, again, 4 threads that each are made up of 6 different items. Va'arba zav, 4 of them made of gold. Arba, so the Gemara says, I'm sorry, let me read that again. Arba the shisa. So you have 4 of them that are made up of 6 strands each. Esin va'arba, that gives you a 24 strand count. The Gemara says zav arba, then another 4 strands made up of gold. Ha esrin v'tamnia, that gives you 28. And I will say that gives you the total number of strands that go into each thread. Ve'ema zav nami shisha. I will say, but why not zav? Why don't we say that zav is made up of, that there are 6 strands of zav in every single thread, just like the other items mentioned? Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov, Amar Kra, v'katzatz psilim. The pasuk says, you shall go ahead and cut the strands, psilim. It could have said psil, but instead it says psilim. Harekan dalid. Ultimately, again, that teaches me a minimum of 4. Rav Ashi Amakra, lasos besocha tchelis besocha argaman. You shall go ahead and do it inside of the tchelis or inside of the argaman. Heichi navid. What should you do? Navid arba. Navid arba de tray. If you make 4 threads made out of 2 strands each, havilu tamnia, that gives you 8. Na'avid tray. If you go ahead and you make 2 strands of 2 threads each, utrei de chad, and ultimately 2 then have made of 1. The pasuk says, "Vasisa shukol asios of shavos." Torah says, "You shall make it," which also indicates to you that every thread must be the same. Okay, so we'll say that brings to a close that sugyo. All the Gemara trying to do is highlight to us the different number of, we'll call it, strand counts in each thread, which I will say just highlights for us the incredible specificity with which the Mishkan, and well, originally the Mishkan, then the Mikdash, both the Kalim as well as the garments were made. That you see again the incredible thread counts. I will say that each thread being made up of multiple individual strands, and not just that, but often you have different. You have one thread being made up of multiple different types of strands, and again, each item having a different strand count per thread. Good. Amar Rachba, Amar Rav Yehuda, Hamikareya Bigdei Kahuna. Let's listen to this interesting case. If a person tears Bigdei Kahuna, Say you tear big day kuna, loke. Ultimately, again, one gets malchus. One gets malchus. So it's obviously talking about if one intentionally goes ahead and tears big day kuna, one is subject to malchus. Shene Amar, the pasuk says, Gemara quotes over the pasuk, Lo yikareya. Literally again, it shall not be torn. Lo yikareya. So the Gemara says, Maskif la Ravacha bar Yaakov v'doma hachi kamar achmana. Maybe this is what the Torah is trying to say. Na'avid le safa ki hechid lo nikra. Maybe the Torah is saying that no, you should make a hem for the garment so that it should not get torn. In other words, maybe the Torah is not telling me that halacha lemaisa I'm not allowed to tear, but the Torah is telling me structure a hem for the garment so that it does not get torn. So the Gemara says, Miktziv shelo yikra. Does the Torah say so that it shall not be torn? In other words, we'll say the lashon is lo yikareya, you shall not tear it. And therefore, again, not lo yikra. So I will say, so the Torah is not telling me construct the garment in a way that it does not tear. The Torah is telling me don't tear big day kahuna. It's a lav. And if you tear big day kahuna, therefore what? Halach lemaisa, you will be chayiv. Amar Rabbi Lazar, hamaziach choshen me'ala ephod. But say if somebody goes ahead and loosens, maziach actually, Rashi says over here it means loosens. Maziach usually means to move, but it's the same idea. In other words, that the choshen, remember again, the way the choshen lies is you have the ephod, the apron. Remember, choshen is the breastplate, only worn by the Kohen Gadol, right? So remember again, that choshen is affixed to the ephod. You have an apron. The apron is like an interesting. It's kind of, if you could imagine, it's a backwards apron, right? Imagine an apron lahavdal that you wear in the kitchen, right? So it has a front. It doesn't have a back. So the ephod of the Kohen Gadol is like flipped around. It has a back but doesn't have a front. And what you have over here is that the choshen is affixed to the apron in two places. You have two chains that go up from the ephod, that go up from the choshen and attach to the shoulders of the ephod, and two chains that go to the side and attach on the sides of the ephod. The Torah says that halacha l'maisa, the ephod is not supposed to move. I'm sorry, the choshen, right? The choshen is supposed to be affixed to the ephod. We're going to see here. Let's read it. So the Gemara says, "Hamazia choshen me'alef." But we'll say second wide line, ayin beis amud aleph. If one goes ahead and loosens the choshen from the ephod, v'hamasir bade aron. Similarly, again, if you go ahead and you remove the poles of the aron, loke, you get malchus. You get malchus. It's an isur d'oraisa. Shene amar, because the pasuk says, "V'lo yizach hachoshen me'al ha'ephod." We'll say pretty explicit. The Torah says the choshen shall not move off the ephod, and it also says v'lo yasuru habadim. The poles should not be removed from the aron. So we'll say some maskef Ravacha bar Yaakov. Maybe the Torah means something else. V'dilma ki ka'amar rachmana chadkinu va'avdinu shapir kadesh lo yizach v'lo yasuru. So we'll say what the Gemara says is like this. Maybe the pasuk is not telling me that I'm not allowed to move the choshen, or the pasuk is not telling me that I can't remove the poles, but rather what? The pasuk is telling me that you have to fix it firmly enough in place so that it doesn't fall out. In other words, they're both saying there are two ways to look at the pasuk. The way the Gemara was looking at the pasuk was, Torah is telling me, do not move the choshen, do not remove the poles. It's a lav, it's a prohibition. The Gemara is suggesting maybe that's not what the Torah is saying. Maybe the Torah is saying is when you fasten the ephod when you fasten the choshen to the ephod, fasten it tightly enough that it will not move. When you put the poles in the aron, fasten it tightly enough that it will not fall out. So it's not a prohibition on me doing something, but rather it's a construction detail. Right, a construction detail or a placement detail, to which the Gemara says, and I will say the nafkamina would be if you end up moving the choshen, or if you end up going ahead and removing the poles. If you hold that it's an instruction, then you violated an isur d'oraisa. If you hold it's a construction detail, then you have not violated an isur d'oraisa. To which the Gemara says, miksiv shelo yizach or shelo yasur. Both say, does the Torah say shelo yizach? Does the Torah say, fasten the choshen to the ephod so that it won't move? put the poles, fasten the poles to the Aron so that it won't move. That's not what the Torah says. The Torah says instead, lo yizach, do not move the choshen from the ephod. Do not remove the poles from the Aron. It's an instruction. It's an instruction. It's an obligation on the individual, not simply a construction detail. Therefore, if one goes in and moves the choshen, or one removes the pole from the Aron, ultimately, again, they get malchus. Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina, Rami Ksiv. What's Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina? Contrast two psukim. On one hand, the pasuk says, "B'tabaos ha'aron yiyu abadim lo yasir meno." Both the Torah says that the poles of the Aron shall be in the rings. Remember, again, you had the ark, the Aron. There were rings on the side of the Aron, and the poles, right, the badim, were put inside of the poles. So on one hand, the pasuk says, the poles are inserted into the rings. You shall not remove the poles. Uksiv v'huva es badav b'tabaos. But yet then the pasuk says that you shall place the poles inside of the rings. So I will say, so again, look at Rashi for just a moment. K'skasav lo yasuru alma ein zazin mehen. So I will say, interestingly enough, what the Gemara is highlighting over here is as follows. That halacha l'maisa, when it says you'll put the poles in, you can't remove them, that sounds like the poles are unremovable. Then it says, v'huva ba'da b'tabaos, you'll put the poles into the ring. Well, if you're putting the poles into the ring, then what? Bepashus, you can take them out, which sounds like they are movable. So what's going on? Ha-ketzad, I will say this is fascinating. Ha-ketzad, misparkin ve'ein nishmatin. Misparkin nishmatin, which means I will say the poles were loose, but they could not come out. They were loose, but they could not come out. What does this mean? Take a look at Rashi. Misparkim ve'ein nishmatin, berasheim hayu avim, ve'chichnis roshan echad b'dochak b'tabas, u'be'emtzon hayadakin. Hilchach, though hayu nitchakin b'tabaos, ela misparkin v'holkin lekan lekan, ava inon nishmatin lotzeis mehen, lefishin of Moshe. Supposed to say this is really quite fascinating. The way the poles were made was like this. The ends were thick, and the middle was a bit thinner. So what would happen? In order to get it through the ring, what would you have to do? You'd have to apply a significant amount of force. Right? In other words, it was not easy to get the poles through. You had to apply a significant amount of force. Once you got them through the ring, what would happen? You'd be able to move them back and forth. But what could you not do? What couldn't you do? You couldn't remove it. So I will say, by the way, we saw this before, that the poles themselves were moved. If you remember again, where do we see this? Because remember again, when the Aron sat in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, so we'll say, what did they do with the poles? Remember, what did they do? They pushed the poles out so that the poles would extend into the curtain. So you see the poles were movable back and forth, but because the ends were thick, the poles could not be taken Pretty incredible. So we'll say, so the Gemara says, Ketzad, misparkin ve'in nishmatin. Tanya Navachar that supports this, but tabaos Aron yu abadim. So the pasuk says that in the rings of the Aron the poles will be. So yachol lo yu zazim kolman. You might have thought that maybe the poles are unmovable. Tamalomar v'huvas badav betabaos. Therefore the pasuk says, you shall place the poles in the rings. But maybe you would think that the poles can be taken in and out. Therefore the pasuk says, in the rings shall the poles remain. How do you reconcile this? The poles can move, but they cannot be removed. So they can move back and forth within the rings, but they cannot be removed. Which I will say, if you think about this, it's an incredible hashkafa in this as well. Which is, remember again, the Aron represents Torah. We're familiar with this metaphor. The Aron represents Torah. The idea of the poles being irremovable is the idea that Torah goes with me wherever I go. This was the yesod. What I was saying, think about this in just a moment. The other utensils also had poles. Every other utensil had poles. How else did they transport it? Right? So the shulchan had poles. The mizbeach had poles. And what happened again when you place, right, when the Jews camped in the desert and you placed the kli down, what happened? You took the poles out. That's the way it worked. The Aron was the only utensil where when you put the poles in, the poles did not come out. What's the hashkafa, Rabbi Osai? The hashkafa is Torah goes with me everywhere. Right? There's no such thing as Torah being situated in one place, immobile. The poles always remain, highlighting the idea that Torah goes with me wherever I go in life. But interestingly enough, perhaps the poles being movable back and forth indicates that the way Torah manifests itself and the way I carry Torah and the way ultimately I apply Torah may be different in different situations. In other words, the carrying of the Torah is not always the same. Sometimes the poles are pushed this way, sometimes the poles are pushed that way. So the way you carry it, and sometimes even the way it's observed and the way it's applied, that may change a little bit from circumstance to circumstance. But the poles always remain because it always travels with. It always accompanies me, but sometimes the application of it, how you carry it, when you carry it, where you carry it, that sometimes changes based on different life circumstances. An incredible yisod. So the Gemara goes weiter. Amar Rabbi Chama Rabbi Chanina, Mai dichsiv aseh shitim omnim. So I will say the pasuk says when talking about the krushim, the boards of the Mishkan, it says Atzei Shitim Omdin. Remember, the Mishkan, the boards of the Mishkan, the walls were made of acacia wood. Atzei Shitim. So the Torah says something very interesting. You have to make it of standing acacia wood. What does that mean, standing acacia wood? So the Gemara says, what do you mean Omdim? We'll say this is very interesting. The Gemara says, Omdim derech gidi lasan. Both say this is very fascinating. When you fashioned the boards and you stood the boards up, the boards had to be placed the way they grew. In other words, we both say, so the boards were taken from the trees, right? But the idea is that the boards were placed in the part of the wall, derech gidi lasan, the way they grew. So in other words, when making the board and placing the board, you would use the board that came from the bottom part of the tree on the bottom, and ultimately, again, the top part of the tree on top. So the Gemara will say, so what's the pshat? Why would the Torah be makbid on derech gidilas? And Rashi says, ha'elyon lamala, v'atachton lamata, the upper parts of the wood on top and the bottom part of the parts on the bottom. Because remember again, the entire point of the Mishkan was to facilitate spiritual growth. Both say in order to have spiritual growth, a person has to live life derech gidilasan. There has to be a plan. There has to be a seder. We speak about this all the time. You see, if my ruchnios is kind of chaplap, as they say, if there's no rhythm and there's no plan and there's no structure to it, then ultimately, again, a person has bursts of inspiration, bursts of aliyah, but there's no real sustained growth. If a person wants to truly make a relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam, it has to happen derech gidilasan. It has to happen ultimately, again, in structured stages of incremental growth. It can't just be whatever, whenever, however. It must be part of a structured plan. Davar acher, another possibility is omdim. What does it mean omdim? Shema tomar avad sivran ubatal sikuyan. I will say this is incredible. You might have thought that once the Mishkan is gone, avad sivran means its promise has been lost. Batal sikuyan, its hope is lost. Talmud lomar omdim. I'm sorry, I skipped the line. Davar acher omdim shema amidin as sipuyan. I will say the other possibility is, remember, the boards of the Mishkan were gold plated. Were gold plated. So omdim also means you have to fasten the plating to the board in a way that the board is able to go ahead and uphold or hold up the plating itself. Okay, so then, according to this approach, I will say it's more of like an architectural detail. I'd say shitim omdim, make sure to affix the gold to the boards in a way that the boards can maintain the gold plating on top of them. Rashi says over here, Shema amidin sipuyan sipuy azav ma'amidin ayde mismaros. They would nail the plating to the boards. Lashon acher shlachet. Fine. So the Gemara says, "Davar acher omdim shema tomer avid sivran abata sikuyon." The other possibility is, what does omdim mean? Or maybe omdim means you might have thought that once the Mishkan was hidden away, maybe literally again their promise is lost, their hope is lost. In other words, maybe the Mishkan doesn't do anything for us now that it's gone. Talmud lomar omdim. Therefore, the pasuk says, "Omdin she'omdin li'olam u'li'olamim." Ultimately, again, that the power of the Mishkan remains for all eternity. And I will say this is actually an incredible yisod as well, because if you think about this, very often when we think about the Mishkan, we kind of assume it to be what? It was a stopgap, right? It was a stopgap until we're able to get to Yerushalayim finally and build the Beis Hamikdash there. So what the Gemara is saying is like this: even to this very day, the Mishkan benefits us. In other words, there is no such thing as a ruchni, as a spiritual endeavor that does not go ahead and benefit Klal Yisrael for all eternity. Anything and everything we do in our avodas Hashem contains and maintains a certain power for Am Yisrael. So even the Mishkan, right? The Mishkan is long gone, and we're never going to have a Mishkan again. We daven every day for a third base of Mikdash. We're never going to have a Mishkan again. Lest you think, therefore, that the Mishkan has lost its meaning. So the Gemara says, Ase Shitim Omdim. The Mishkan still stands for us to this very day. The schus of the Mishkan still stands for Klal Yisrael till this very day. Because Rabbi said there is no such thing as a spiritual endeavor that does not yield constant ruchni dividends. Anything we do in this world continues to pay spiritual dividends, li olam va'ed, even the Mishkan, an incredible yisod. So the Gemara goes right. Es bigdi hasrad l'sharis b'kodesh. What does the pasuk mean when it says the bigdi hasrad? Right? Rashi says loshon srid. We'll see how the Gemara darshans it. The big. Now we'll say now this is a reference to the big day kahuna. Torah calls the big day kahuna big day srad. What does this mean? Amud beis ilmale big day kahuna lo nishtayir misonen shal yisrael srid upalit. We'll say were it not for the big day kahuna, there would be nothing left of Klal Yisrael. We'll see, when the Torah speaks about sonei and shal yisrael, sonei and shal yisrael is a metaphor for when we sin. Right? When we sin, we are called enemies of Klal Yisrael, which is a pretty dramatic statement, right? So when I commit an Aveira, I'm called an enemy of the Jewish people. Because they will say, when I commit an Aveira, I'm undermining not only my own interests, but I'm undermining the interests of the collective, of the Klal. So when I commit an Aveira, I am called an enemy of Klal Yisrael. So the Torah says, we're not for the big day kahuna. We're not for the big day kahuna. There would be nothing left of Klal Yisrael. Look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, Rashi is on both sides on this daf. So take a look at Rashi on the right-hand side. Ilmali big day kahuna, shayedeyan makrivin akarbanos hamechaper al Yisrael. So let's remember again, it's the big day kahuna which allow for the offering of karbanos. So were it not for the big day kahuna, and therefore again the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash, there would be nothing left of Klal Yisrael. So we'll say ultimately again the avodah of the Mikdash, the big day kahuna, serve as a schos for us. Rabbi Shlomo Nachmani Amar Debei Reb Shimon Tana Begadim Shegardin Osan Kibriyasan Michlehen Umisardin Mehen Klum. So this is very interesting. So Reb Shimon understands a little bit differently. Or time to Reb Shimon says a little bit differently. That big day Sarabah say, interestingly enough, big day kahuna were not sewn, but rather they were made on a loom. On a loom. And the way it was done is essentially the garment was kind of removed whole from the loom. That's what it means when it says Shagorin Osan Kibriyasan Michlehen. You go out and you remove them whole from the loom, Umisardin Mehem Klum. But you leave a little something left over that the garment still has to be finished. What did they leave over? Maihi, Reish Lakish Amar Elu Masemechet. This refers ultimately again to the sewing they had to do. So what's sewing? So Meisve, big day kuna in Osan Masemechet Elamase Oreg. But we learned also the Brisa says big day kuna was not sewn. We'll say it was made on a loom. Shneimar Masa Oreg. Because the Torah says that it's woven, right? The Torah says something being woven and something being sewn, right? Something being sewn is a needle and thread. Being woven is on a loom. So Abaye lo nitzrucha ella lebeis yachal. Listen to this. This is fascinating. Abaye says the Veitikunu were both woven and sewn. We're going to see. I will say that right now. Essentially, I don't know what the technical term is for it, but the body of the garment. So let me illustrate this best. Maybe with the kisonas, right? The tunic, right? So says, if you could imagine, it's one big cylinder, right? It's one, right? So that was made on a loom that came off the loom. Then what happened? The sleeves were sewn. Sleeves were sewn and then subsequently attached to the body of the me'il. So the Gemara says that's what it means. The sleeves themselves were sewn on. Kidisanya, base yad shel big day kahuna ne'ereges bifnei atzma, v'nidbekes im habeged. The sleeves of the big day kahuna were ultimately again woven on their own, right? Were sewn on their own, and then ultimately sewn onto the beged of the big day kahuna. Umagas ad pisas hayat. Rebbe said this is very interesting. The tailoring of the sleeves of the big day kahuna, will say, the sleeves went until the palm, which is just interesting because a little bit different than, right, I guess the way we tailor sleeves contemporarily, right, that you take it somewhere, I don't know, somewhere to the wrist. So the big day kahuna ultimately, again, went until the palm. So Amr Yehuda, We'll say, listen to how beautiful this is. Shalosh aronos asa Betzalel. We'll say, listen to how beautiful this Gemara is. Betzalel made 3 arons, 3 arcs. Now, really, what it means is we're going to see really means 3 boxes in the aron, right? That the aron abris, the ark itself, was comprised of 3 boxes. Hamtsoy shalitz, ultimately again a middle box made of wood. Tisha. Ultimately, again, so the middle one was made of wood and had a height of 9 tefachim. Pinimi shel zahav, there was an inner box of gold. Ultimately, shmona, it measured a height of 8 tefachim. Chitzon asara umashahu. The outer box, Rabbi Osai, was once again also made of gold, and it had a height of 10 tefachim and a little bit. So we'll say, so 3 boxes, gold outside, wood in the middle, gold on the inside, right? Measurements, outer one 10 tefachim high, the middle one 9 tefachim high, inner one 8 tefachim high. Where we learned, but we learned elsewhere that the outer box ultimately had a height of 11 tefachim and a little bit. Lo kasha, we'll say there's a machlokes. What's the machlokes? This is fascinating. Hakiman damar yesh ba'aviv tefach, hakiman damar ein ba'aviv tefach. So we'll say, interestingly enough, halacha l'maisa, there is a machlokes about the thickness of the floor of the bottom box. I should say of the outer box, right? So as machlokes, one opinion says the floor of the outer box had a thickness of a tefach. Where I will say, if the floor of the bottom of the outer box has the thickness of a tefach, then what does that do to the height of the outer box? Pushes it up an additional tefach. So according to the opinion who says that the floor of the outer box had a tefach of thickness, then that pushes the height of the outer box up to 11 tefachim and a little bit. But according to the opinion who hold that the outer box, the floor did not have the thickness of a tefach, then halacha l'maisa, the height of the walls was only 10 tefachim and a little bit. I both say just about these boxes is actually a very beautiful idea. The Maggid of Mezrich says something truly beautiful, because obviously there must be a symbolism in this. Why 3 boxes? First of all, you could just make a golden aron, right? Why do you need 3 boxes? Gold, wood, gold. So we'll say it's quite beautiful. So the Maggid of Mezrich says so beautifully. He says that, remember that the aron represents Torah, right? Gold, remember the gold of the aron, just like the gold of all the utensils, was a pure gold. He holds that the gold on the inside, gold on the outside, represents the idea that in life you have to live with certain immutable principles. Right? There have to be guiding light principles that I use in my life. That's the gold, right? Gold is a, at least from this perspective, like an immutable substance. It is what it is. The same gold today is the same gold tomorrow. So on the inside and the outside, you have to have your principles by which you live your life, and the principles which you won't compromise. The middle is wood. Well, so let's understand wood and gold. Wood is organic, right? Wood grows. As much as you have to live life with constant immutable principles, there also always has to be a part of your persona that is ready and willing to evolve. And I will say, isn't this the incredible dialectic in life? There are certain things that I have to say will never change. Certain things about me, maybe even certain things about my lifestyle, that they are what they are, they will not change. But if you live life with that mantra, that's incredibly dangerous. There always has to be a middle box made of organic wood. A middle box that's subject to growth. A middle box that says just because things have been done a certain way until now, doesn't mean they should be done the same way going forward. Just because I've been a certain way until now, doesn't mean I should be the same way going forward. Keep gold on the inside, gold on the outside, but organic wood that is willing to evolve and grow in the middle. Incredible Gemara. I'm going to be Yochanan. We'll say, this is my mashu. So we'll say, here's what's interesting. What's fascinating about this in general, when you look at the measurements of the Mishkan, right, everything is incredibly precise. Yet, what is the Gemara saying over here? We'll say, what was the size of the outer box? What did the Gemara just say? What was the size of the outer box? 10 tefachim umashu, and a little bit. What do we need a little bit? What is that mashu? To which the Gemara says, zer. We'll say, around the edge of the aron was literally a decorative border that extended above the wall. Zer literally means a crown. So I will say, so again, there was a decorative, by the way, the Aron wasn't the only thing with the Zer. We're going to see there were other Kalim that had this decorative border that extended above the wall of the Aron, right? Above the side. So you had the side, so the side ended at 10 tefachim high. We'll go with the first opinion. The side, the wall of the Aron was 10 tefachim high, and then above that wall, there was a little decorative crown that went around the walls of the Aron. Both say, listen to how beautiful this is. Rabbi Yochanan, Shlosha Zeirim Hein. There are 3 different crowns in the Beis Hamikdash. Shel Mizbeach v'Shel Aron v'Shel Shulchan. Both say 3 different crowns. There was a crown, and when we say crown, we mean decorative, right? Decorative edge on the walls. There was a crown. There was a zer, a crown on the Mizbeach, a crown on the Aron, and a crown on the Shulchan. Both say the Maharsha points out that what does this represent? The 3 ksarim, the 3 crowns that exist within Yiddishkeit. And what are the 3 crowns which exist within Yiddishkeit? Keser Kahuna, Keser Malchus, Keser Torah. Right? The crown of Kahuna, the crown of monarchy, the crown of Torah. Both listen to how beautiful this is. Shal Mizbeach Zacha Aaron. So the crown of the Mizbeach, which represents the crown of the Kahuna, who gets that? That's Aaron. So the Gemara says, Vinatlo, Shal Shulchan. Both say the crown of the Shulchan. And this is very interesting. What does the Shulchan represent? So I say, interesting, the Shulchan usually represents what? Wealth. Wealth. Now, in this context, so wealth, monarchy, influence, right? Wealth is influence. That's monarchy, Zacha David. Ultimately, again, that's David HaMelech. The Vinatlo, Shal Aron. So I will say, what does the crown of the Aron represent? That represents, again, the Keser Torah. Adayin Munach. I will say, that crown is still up for grabs. Kol harotze likach yavo v'yikach. I will say, isn't this absolutely incredible? Keser Kahuna, not accessible to everyone. Right? Keser Malchus, not accessible to everyone. Keser Torah is accessible to everyone. Whoever wants the crown is yours. Shema Tomar, Pachosu. So maybe you'll say, that must mean it's less important. Right? There was another. We generally equate importance with exclusivity. Right, the more exclusive something is, the more important it is. So must be Keser Kuna, Keser Malchus. Those are much more important because Lamaisa, they're exclusive. Keser Torah, anyone could have it. Well, if anyone could have it, it can't be that important. So the Gemara says, Talmud Lomar, Bi Malachim Yamluchu. Kadosh Baruch Hu says, it is only through me that kings are made. Ultimately, I will say, the Keser Torah is mamish access to the Ribono Shel Olam. And access to the Ribono Shel Olam is in and of itself the most important thing in this world. So we'll say, isn't this absolutely beautiful? The Keser Torah, the crown of Torah, is open and accessible to whoever wants it. You can't have Kahuna if you're not a Kohen. Can't have Malchus if you're not a descendant of David HaMelech. But if you truly want the most important crown of all, the crown of Torah, it is open and accessible to each and every one of us. So inspirational. Rabbi Yochanan Miksiv. Rabbi Yochanan contrasts the Psukim. Zar, Vikarinan, Zer. So I will say the word, when you look at it, is actually written, right? Because it's not written Zayin Yud Reish. It's written Zar. Zar, I will say, literally means stranger or alien. We vocalize it, we pronounce it as Zer, which means literally, again, a crown. So the Gemara says, Zocha Naasis Lo Zer. But say if a person is deserving, then ultimately, again, Torah becomes for him a crown. Lo Zacha, Zara Himenu. If he's not Zocha, Torah becomes alien to him. Now, both say, what does this mean? Take a look at Rashi. It's the bottom of the right-hand column. It's quite beautiful as well. Zacha, lilmo Torah l'shma l'kaima. Both say, what does Zacha mean? If you learn Torah l'shma. If you learn Torah l'shma. Both say, what does it mean to learn Torah l'shma? If a person learns Torah as a way ultimately of connecting with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Both say, it's interesting that, a person can learn Torah, a person can learn Shas, and not feel any closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You could feel great, and you could feel smarter, and you could feel enriched, but lav dafka that it enhances your relationship with Hashem. Torah l'shma means I learn Torah because I want a relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam. That's why I learn. That's called Torah l'shma. If you learn Torah l'shma, then ultimately, again, Torah becomes a crown. But if you don't learn Torah l'shma, then ultimately it becomes alien to you. It becomes alien to you. Rashi says, what does it mean it becomes alien to you? This is incredible. Zacha, mishtachach mimenu. You forget it. Which I will say is really something very interesting. The Gemara links retention to learning Lishma. which is really fascinating because a lot of us struggle with retention. Well, Daf Yomi might be a little bit different, or given just the sheer pace of things. But I will say, isn't it fascinating that kind of the litmus test for my lishma is right? The litmus test for my lishma is retention. If I remember, that's a pretty good indication on learning lishma. Lishma means to cultivate our relationship with Hashem. If I don't remember, that may be indicative of the fact that maybe although I'm learning, which is incredible, maybe the motivations aren't as pure as they need to be. Quite incredible. So we'll say interesting contrast of psukim. The pasuk says, you shall make for you an aron made of wood. The Rabbi say this pasuk makes it sound like what? That Moshe Rabbeinu has to make the aron himself. Uksiv, and then the pasuk says, "Va'asu aron atzei shitim." They will make an aron made of acacia wood. So who's making it? Is it Moshe or is it the people? Who's making it? To which the Gemara said, "Mikan tam chacham shebnei iro mitzuvin la'asos lo malachtu." I will say from here we see that when a city has a Talmid Chacham who lives in its midst, the townspeople should take care of the Talmid Chacham so that his work is done for him, that he does not have to go ahead and engage in the work. He could devote himself exclusively to the learning of Torah. But take a look at Rashi. How do you see this? So Rashi says over here, "Mitzuvin lasos malachto sha'aron b'tchila hetila kasef hamalacha am Moshe v'achach hetila." So I see the idea being at first, HaKadosh Baruch Hu places the construction of the Aron on Moshe, but then removes it and places it on the community, creating a model that if there is a true Talmid Chacham who lives within the community should see to the needs of the Talmid Chacham, so that Talmid Chacham is able to devote himself to Avodas Hashem, and the work gets done through the community. Well, it's interesting, no matter what, the work's got to get done, right? There's always work to get done. The shaila just is, whose shoulders does it rest upon? So at least initially it rests upon the Talmid Chacham, but it's almost like an Eitzah Tova. The community wants the Talmid Chacham to fully self-actualize, because his self-actualization is the community's benefit as well. So the community therefore should remove the yoke of that responsibility of the labor, get the job done, so Talmid Chacham is able to focus on what he's truly meant to focus on. A beautiful Gemara. You shall coat the aron on the inside and outside with gold, because as we've seen before, 3 boxes. There's gold on the outside, gold on the inside. Amirava, this is beautiful. Kol Talmid Chacham she'ein tocho kibaro eino Talmid Chacham. Any Talmid Chacham, literally again, whose inside is not like his outside, is not a Talmid Chacham. So also, this is actually quite beautiful as well. The idea being the symbolism of gold inside and outside means that a Talmid Chacham, who is supposed to represent Torah, has to be genuine. Kind of go back to Reb Tzaddik as well. Has to be genuine. Gold on the inside, gold on the outside. So we'll say, but 1 second. What's the hole in this argument? What about the wood in the middle, right? It's not fully gold. But let's say, so I think Gemara is teaching us an incredible yisod. Never go ahead and confuse genuinity. I know I made it up, but I like it, right? Genuinity with perfection. It's not the same thing. I could be genuine, but still be highly imperfect. Genuine just means that, we'll say, a lot of times you go through life, and there's the external me, and there is the internal me, right? The external me presents a particular image, but the internal me is someone dramatically different. The Gemara says, Kadosh Baruch Hu doesn't like that. Rosh Hashanah doesn't need that, because again, Kadosh Baruch Hu knows who I really am. So you could project a face to the world, but if that's not really you, Kadosh Baruch Hu says, I'm not interested in that. The Talmid Chacham has to be Tocho Kibaro. Whatever you are on the outside, make sure that that's truly reflected on the inside. But it does not mean perfection. Kadosh Baruch Hu never asks for perfection. He just asks me to be genuine. He just asks me not to be, unfortunately, too often in life we project an image that's not really us. That's not really us. By the way, this cuts both ways. Sometimes he will project an image that's not really them because they're so much better than the image they project. And sometimes we project an image that may have a certain level of inflated piety, when in fact I'm not really that person on the inside. Kadosh Baruch Hu says, just be genuine. Same person on the inside, outside. But again, I might be wood in the middle. I am wood in the middle. I'm filled with imperfections, right? I'm filled with maybe even a little bit of decay, maybe even a little bit of mold, maybe even a little bit of growth on it. I'm filled with all these things, but that doesn't detract from who I am. I'm a human being. So of course I have wood in the middle. Because Baruch Hu is not telling me to get rid of my wood. Because Baruch Hu is not telling me to get rid of my imperfection. Because Baruch Hu is saying, acknowledge it, embrace it, but just be a genuine individual. We'll have to stop over here. So much more to that. I promised you, incredible Gemara. We'll pick up over here in Mirat Hashem tomorrow. I think tomorrow we're going to start at 5:45 with the Daf in Mirat Hashem. So tomorrow we'll start at 5:45. Shkayach Abosai.